Welcome! Thank you for joining in for this Houston Metropolitan Research Center webinar. My name is Elizabeth Mayer and I am the Preservation Librarian at HMRC. Today's program is the second part in a two-part series to help people identify historic materials in their own collections. Today's webinar will be focused entirely on the history of photographic processes. This presentation will be a historical retrospective on the development and change of photography from some of the earliest photographic processes found in collections to the more modern printed photo processes. I will be discussing how to identify and date photos using the context clues of appearance and condition. As this program series is focused on the identification and care of physical collections, I won't be discussing any digital photo processes today. Identifying historic photos can be a particularly tricky process. Many of the identifying features are better observed in person rather than from a still image. Despite the challenge, however, being able to identify phototypes based on appearance can be incredibly helpful when keeping photo collections. For this program, each phototype will be described as detailed as possible in order to convey the physical differences between each individual process. Identifying phototypes can also play a role in determining the provenance or ownership history of a photo. Phototypes can be traced to a specific time period as well as specific photo trends, such as whether or not personal photography or studio photography were more likely to be used. Being able to identify historic phototypes is also especially important for the long-term preservation of photo collections. Each phototype is different and will have its own unique physical and chemical deteriorations. Different chemicals that are developed onto different surfaces or supports will each react differently to factors such as age, light, or humidity. The first group of photos we will be discussing are the phototypes that were developed between 1839 and 1870. At this time, many different photographic processes were developed. This was a time period of experimentation and innovation. These photo processes were developed almost exclusively by photo studios, so photography was something that had to be commissioned by families rather than taking their own personal photographs. The first phototype I'll be discussing is also the first commercially available photographic process. The Daguerreotype, named after its inventor, Louis-Jacques Daguerre, was created in 1839. This process is one of a handful of photograph processes referred to as a cased photograph, due to the way that it is commonly packaged. The full cased daguerreotype consists of several parts. The photo itself is developed on a polished and silver-coated copper plate that has been coated in a series of chemicals and silver salts. In a cased photo, the copper plate will rest in a wooden case with a brass mat framing the photo, a glass cover, and a silk or velvet pad on the inside of the wooden case. A daguerreotype can be distinguished from other cased photographs because this photo can appear as either a positive or a negative image depending on the angle of the light, as you can see in these two photo examples here. This means that when angled towards a light source, the colors of the photo will appear in reverse. Due to the variety of materials utilized in a daguerreotype, there are a variety of chemical and physical deteriorations that they can be susceptible to. The wooden cases can break, crack, or rot, the metal frames can tarnish, and most notably, as can be seen in this example photo, glass can deteriorate in a phenomenon known as weeping glass, in which moisture in the environment seeps into the cover glass and leaves deposits that can appear as crystalline deposits on the glass. While much of the deterioration is a natural process of aging, keeping these photos in a cool, dry area with limited handling will help to preserve the photo. The second phototype we'll discuss is called the Ambrotype. This phototype is often confused with the Daguerreotype due to the fact that both photos are often cased photographs, and both processes were created around the same time. However, the Ambrotype was developed around a few years after the Daguerreotype, and there are a few physical differences. The first is that the colors of the Ambrotype appear slightly softer and have a whiter, more pearly sheen than a Daguerreotype image. Another major difference is that an Ambrotype is developed on a glass plate with a black backing material that renders the glass plate negative as a positive image. Ambrotypes overtook daguerreotypes as the popular commercial photography type due to the fact that they were faster and cheaper to produce. Ambrotypes can experience many of the same deteriorations as daguerreotypes. However, there is one type of deterioration that Ambrotypes have that daguerreotypes don't. Reticulation, which is the flaking away of the backing varnish on the glass plate of the photo. This can be noticed by the color differences in the areas where the varnish has cracked and flaked away. The albumen print was the dominant photograph type of the latter half of the 1800s. Albumen prints are photos printed onto a paper support that is developed with a combination of chemicals and a coating of egg whites, which is where the name albumen comes from. Albumen prints are identifiable by their warm tones that range from light brown sepia tones to deeper reds and purples. As the photo is printed onto paper, albumen prints are mounted onto thick card that keeps the photo from curling due to age and exposure to humidity. The coating of egg whites will also yellow with age and light exposure and will have cracks that are visible without magnification. The colors shift towards yellow or dark brown. Small brown age spots and a thin but visible layer of cracked gloss are all strong indicators of an albumen print that has badly aged. Because albumen prints were also commonly commissioned by photography studios, the thicker cards that the photos are mounted onto often contain the name and location of the photography studio and occasionally the order numbers or the name of the family that commissioned the portraits written on the back, which can be very helpful to research the history of the photo as well as conduct genealogy research. Albumen photos can be printed into a variety of formats, but perhaps the two most recognizable variations on the albumen print are the Carte-de-Visite and the cabinet card. The Carte-de-Visite was a 4.5 by 2 inch piece of cardstock with a slightly smaller albumen photo attached and was popularly used from the late 1850s through the late 1870s. The name Carte-de-Visite comes from the visiting card, a social etiquette staple of the late 1800s of roughly the same size of a carte-de-visite photo. These visiting cards were sent to homes as a first step for making formal social introductions. In the 1860s, the cabinet card was introduced, and throughout the next decade began to supersede the carte-de-visite. The cabinet card was made with a slightly thicker cardstock that was also larger at 6.5 by 4.5 inches. The larger scale and the increased thickness led to the cabinet card becoming the more popular studio portrait type up until the 1890s, in which larger studio portraits became more available and postcards filled the need for scenic photographs printed onto thicker, more durable cardstock. The tintype photo may be the easiest type to recognize at first glance. These photograph types are developed onto a thin sheet of metal, although the name tintype is a slight misnomer, as the metal used for these plates was most often iron. These thin sheets of iron were lacquered in black or dark brown pigments, and the photo was developed onto binding materials layered on top of the iron. The tintype is categorized as a direct positive image. However, similar to the Ambrotype, the photo is technically a type of negative that appears as a positive image because it is placed onto a black background. A telltale indicator that the image is a negative is that printed words will appear backwards in tintypes. The tintype was developed in the 1860s and became popular due to how quickly and cheaply they could be developed and were heavily produced during the Civil War. Tintypes can be produced as small as 3/4 of an inch by 1 inch, called gems, to as large as 8 by 10 inches. Tintypes can be susceptible to a wide variety of physical damages. The iron can bend, break, warp, or rust, which can cause the photo image to distort or lift away from the metal support. Keeping them in a low humidity environment is very helpful for their long-term preservation. The photos I'll showcase in this section were developed in the late 19th century and were largely in use through the early to mid-20th century. All of the photos from this section are black and white prints, but early color photography was beginning to be developed during this time period. It was during this time that personal photography began to be produced in greater numbers in addition to studio portraiture. Additionally, while the phototypes produced during this time period are generally more stable than photos developed much earlier, they are still susceptible to various forms of physical and environmental damage. Platinum photos differentiate themselves from many other phototypes by the absence of a glossy top layer. The platinum photo has a distinctive matte surface. Developed in 1873 by William Willis, platinum photos were popularly used through the 1930s when they were largely replaced by the silver gelatin process. Like other photos from this time period, they were often developed onto a paper support, and the paper fibers are visible on the image without magnification. Platinum photos are unfortunately susceptible to various forms of deterioration, as platinum is a catalyst for deterioration in paper. This deterioration is primarily identifiable as a yellow-brown discoloration on the paper support. Platinum deterioration can also cause ghosting, which is when a relief image in a brownish-yellow color is printed onto any paper, card, or tissue that is in direct contact with the image. So, if you see a photo that looks like it has been stamped onto whichever material was placed in front of it, there is a possibility that this is a platinum photo. Storing photos like these with paper or tissue liners in between the images will help to lessen the risk of the photo ghosting onto the back of another photo or onto any other records that you're keeping. Similar to albumen prints, carbon photos are developed onto a thick paper support. These prints are recognizable by their deep brown, almost black tones. While originally used for carbon black prints, carbon photos could also become developed with different colored dyes, an early form of color photography. The carbon print was invented in the latter half of the 19th century and was a popular form of photography in the early 20th century until it became largely replaced by chromogenic prints. Interestingly, of the photographic processes discussed today, the carbon print is one of the most chemically stable as there is no silver or impure chemicals used in the development process of this phototype. Therefore, there is no chemical deterioration on carbon photos. However, the surface of the image is still susceptible to scratching and abrasions, as well as changes in the physical support due to excess humidity. Any phototype that uses paper as a support material will face the same types of damage that paper can endure, so storing these in a nice, cool, dry environment with plenty of folders and other ways to support the image is going to be best for storing these photos. Silver gelatin photographs are one of the most commonly used photographic processes of the 20th century. The process for silver gelatin photographs was developed in 1873 and was used all the way through the end of the 1900s. Because silver gelatin photos could be developed with a variety of color tones and glosses, it can be hard to pinpoint to a defining physical characteristic. Silver gelatin photos are printed onto paper, but over the years, new developments were made for paper that was intended for photographic use. Silver gelatin photos produced around the 1960s and through the end of the 1900s are printed onto coated paper that gives the paper the look and feel of plastic. Many silver gelatin prints have a noticeable white paper border surrounding the image, but this is not a universal feature of these phototypes. There are also a number of identifiable features that occur when a silver gelatin photograph deteriorates. Silver gelatin photos that are exposed to high amounts of heat and humidity will begin to oxidize and develop a reflective sheen known as silver mirroring. You can see in this example photo here that we are already seeing some early silver mirroring in the bottom left corner of this image. Poor storage and handling for these photos can also cause the paper and gelatin layer of the photo to turn yellow, begin to become brittle, and crack. So it is important to keep photos out of direct light and in cool, dry storage areas. In this final section, we will cover early color photography from its development in early 20th century through the innovations in print photography of the late 20th century. While even the earliest photos could be colorized by using dyes and color washes after a print was made, true color photography is another process entirely. As the name suggests, the Carbro print is closely related to the carbon print. The Carbro print is a similar process to the carbon print with the addition of silver bromide paper in the development process. Introduced around 1919, this photo process was popularly used from the 1930s through the 1950s when the dye transfer process and other forms of color photography became more popular. There are a few apparent physical differences between a carbon photo and a Carbro photo, but there are a couple of key indicators to look for. The first is that Carbro prints have very dense, very saturated colors. The Carbro print was often used in advertisements and fashion photography, so often, though this was a color process, paint would have been added to enhance and fill in areas of the photo. The second physical indicator is that Carbro prints often have a thick layer of gloss that lays heavier on the shadows of the picture than on the highlights. This gloss will show up as a reflective sheen on the darker areas of the photograph when held up to the light, as you can see in the example photo here. While there isn't much chemical deterioration of Carbro prints, these photos can still experience a loss of the gelatin layer on the photo due to heavy handling and become misshapen when exposed to high humidity. The chromogenic print is the primary color photo process that was used in the latter half of the 20th century up until the development of digital photography. The photo is made of 3 separate silver gelatin layers that are each sensitive to red, green, and blue light. During development, the photo was introduced to cyan, magenta, and yellow dye, each dye formed on a different layer of the photo. There is no one inventor to credit with the development of the chromogenic process. Rather, the process was developed from a series of new discoveries from various scientists. The most commercially available version of the chromogenic print was developed in 1942 by Kodak, who developed a negative print and film material called Kodacolor. Many chromogenic photos are printed onto acetate supports, as well as resin-coated papers that look and feel like plastic. Chromogenic prints show deterioration in a wide variety of ways, depending on the years in which they were developed. Early prints from the 1940s through the late and 1950s and early 1960s will show extreme dye fading with a strong yellow discoloration. This will appear as a complete yellow wash of color across the photograph. Prints from the late 1950s on can sometimes show their deterioration with a more magenta tone in the dye. After this time, later prints will have less dye fading, but the white borders on the photos will still show yellow discoloration due to the deterioration of the acetate. The dye diffusion transfer, probably better known as its commercial name, the Polaroid, was released in 1963 and was popularly used in the latter half of the 20th century. The photo development process for the dye diffusion can take anywhere from 1 to 5 minutes to complete. These photos are often recognizable by their standard format, with a white frame around the image. Backprinting numbers on the photo can also be used to identify when a photo was taken. There are a number of physical damages and imperfections that can be used to identify whether a photo is a Polaroid. White streaks or white speckles due to imperfections in the printing process can be one of these indicators. Polaroid photos also have poor light stability, which can cause the image to fade and, in earlier photos, have the colors shift to cyan. These photos are also very susceptible to curling, which can be difficult to correct. So, mounting Polaroids on a strong support or in a photo album and keeping these photos away from UV light will go a long way towards preserving the original photos. This will conclude our beginner's look at the history of photographic processes from the 19th and 20th centuries. Thank you again for watching, and if you'd like to know more about our photo collections, the number and email for the Texas Room Reference Service is on the screen. Or, if you'd like to browse some of our digitized collections, please visit the Houston Public Library Digital Archives website at digital.houstonlibrary.org.